There is a city underneath Denver, not a utility tunnel, not a sewer system, a city, with storefronts, with doors that open inward as if someone just stepped through them, with windows at what should be ceiling level. The official story says this happened because of a flood in 1864 and a decision to raise the streets. That story raises more questions than it answers. Before we dive in, comment where in the world you are watching from and don't forget to click subscribe. Walk down Larimer Street in Denver today and you are walking on top of something. The ground beneath your feet is not natural earth. It is not the original grade of the land. It is a constructed surface laid over a previous city that did not simply cease to exist when the new one was built above it. The storefronts of the original Denver are still there underneath. Their facades face streets that are now buried. Their doors still have handles. Their windows, which once looked out onto a bustling commercial district, now look out onto nothing. Sealed brick tunnels that tourists with flashlights occasionally shuffle through on guided underground tours. The official explanation for how this happened is contained in a fairly short paragraph in most Denver history books. In 1864, a flood on Cherry Creek and the South Platte River devastated the original settlement. The city, recognizing that the low-lying original streets would flood again, decided to raise the street grade. The process took decades. As new buildings were constructed, they were built to the new higher street level. The original ground floors of existing buildings became basements. The original basements became sub-basements. And the original street level, with all its intact commercial architecture, simply disappeared below the new surface. This is the official story. It is plausible. It is partially documented. And it leaves open a set of questions that the documentation does not answer. The first question is physical. When you raise a street grade, you do not simply pour fill over an existing city and walk away. You create an engineering problem of significant complexity. The existing buildings have to be connected to the new grade. Utilities have to be routed. Water drainage has to be redesigned. Storefronts have to be reconfigured. This is not a small undertaking. And it requires the kind of organized municipal engineering capacity that Denver in the 1860s and 1870s was not obviously equipped to provide. Denver was incorporated as a city in 1861. 3 years later, the flood occurred. 3 years after that, the street raising project was supposedly underway. This is an extraordinarily young city undertaking an extraordinarily ambitious infrastructure transformation. The labour, the materials, the engineering expertise, and the municipal financial capacity required to raise an entire city's street grade by 8 to 12 feet over a multi-block area in the 1860s and 1870s represents a level of organised capability that historians of the period have not fully interrogated. When you walk through the Denver Underground today, and the tours that take you through what they call the lower level of Larimer Street are real, the spaces are real. You can book them and go. You notice things that the official explanation does not address. The architecture of the underground level is not primitive frontier construction. It is not the rough-hewn, improvised building of a settlement that had existed for only a few years before the flood. The brickwork is sophisticated. The archways are properly keystone arched. The storefronts have decorative cornices. The proportions of the spaces are generous and well considered. This is architecture that takes time to develop. It represents not a 3-year-old frontier settlement, but an established commercial district with real architectural tradition behind it. The second question is documentary. If the street raising project was the organised municipal undertaking that the official history describes, there should be extensive documentation of it. Engineering drawings, municipal contracts. Newspaper coverage of the project as it progressed. Property records showing the transition from ground floor commercial use to basement use as the new grade was established. Some of this documentation exists. Newspaper accounts from the 1870s and 1880s reference the changed street level and the inconvenience it created for businesses whose entrances were now below grade. Property records show transitions in the use of spaces. This partial documentation is what gives the official story its plausibility. But the engineering documentation that would exist for a project of this scale, the surveys of the original grade, the engineering plans for the fill operation, the contracts with the construction firms that carried out the work, is thin. Not absent entirely, but significantly thinner than you would expect for an operation of this magnitude conducted by an established municipal government. Tartaria researchers and alternative historians who have examined the Denver Underground make a specific argument about this documentary thinness. Their argument is not that the documentation was destroyed in some deliberate cover-up. Their argument is simpler and in some ways more unsettling. The documentation is thin because the street-raising story is a retroactive explanation applied to a situation that was not actually the result of deliberate street-raising. In this alternative reading, the lower Denver was not built first and then buried under a raised grade. The lower Denver was already below grade when the surface Denver was being built. The city that is now underground was not the precursor to the city above it. It was a different city, or a different layer of the same location, that predated the settlement that history records as Denver's founding. This is the claim that requires the most careful examination, because it is the most extraordinary. It requires that there was a prior urban settlement at the location of Denver before the events of 1858 and 1859, when the original prospectors and settlers arrived and established the communities that would eventually be incorporated as Denver. It requires that this prior settlement was buried in a way that left its architecture intact. And it requires that the settlers who arrived in the late 1850s either found this buried city and built on top of it without ever adequately documenting what they found, or arrived after it was already buried and simply built over it. The Tartaria framework provides a specific mechanism for how this could have happened. In the Tartaria hypothesis, a global civilization existed before the historical period we have been given, and that civilization was destroyed or buried by a catastrophic event involving massive flooding and sediment deposition sometime in the early to mid-19th century. The survivors of this event, or the populations that moved into the affected areas afterward, either could not or did not document the prior civilization they encountered because the institutional knowledge required to understand what they were looking at had been lost in the catastrophe. Denver, in this reading, Chow was a location that already had urban development before the 1858 gold rush that the official history identifies as the city's founding moment. The structures that are now the Denver Underground are not the early buildings of a frontier settlement subsequently buried by deliberate street raising. They are the remnants of that prior civilization, incorporated into the developing 19th century city in a way that the settlers explained to themselves and to posterity with the most available narrative. We raised the streets after a flood. The flood itself is worth examining more closely. The flood of 1864 was real. It killed people, destroyed property, and caused significant damage to the young settlement. This is documented in multiple sources, including eyewitness accounts and newspaper coverage of the time. The flood is not in dispute. What is in dispute is whether the flood was the cause of the street raising, or whether the street raising explanation was imposed on a situation that the flood happened to make convenient to explain. In other words, did people look at the existing subsurface structures that were already below grade at the time of the flood and decide that the flood gave them a ready-made explanation for why those structures were below grade? Was the flood the cause, or was it the cover story? This is not a distinction that can be resolved with the available documentary evidence, because the documentary evidence itself is what is being questioned. But the physical evidence, the sophistication of the underground architecture, the intact nature of the spaces, the decorative elements that suggest an established rather than a nascent commercial culture, continues to suggest that what is underground is older and more substantial than a frontier settlement of 3 to 5 years duration would typically produce. The specific architectural details of the Denver Underground are the physical evidence that Tartaria researchers find most compelling, and they deserve examination on their own terms separate from the larger theoretical framework. The arched corridors that connect the underground spaces are built with the full brick construction of established 19th century commercial architecture. The keystones are properly set, the brick courses are regular and carefully laid. The mortar joints suggest work done by experienced masons rather than frontier builders, working quickly with whatever materials were available. The decorative elements on the storefront facades, the cornices, the pilasters, the carved brick details, represent an investment of craft labour that would have been extraordinary for a settlement of Denver's documented age. Compare this with the architecture of other frontier settlements of the same era. Virginia City, Nevada, established during the Comstock Lode silver rush of 1859, produced a commercial district within its first decade that was substantial, but clearly the work of rapidly deployed labor using available materials. Deadwood, South Dakota, established in 1876, shows the rough and ready construction of a mining camp that grew explosively without adequate planning or craft resources. The underground Denver, by contrast, shows the architectural character of an established city with a mature building tradition. This discrepancy does not prove the Tartaria hypothesis. There are conventional explanations for it. Denver attracted early capital investment that other frontier settlements did not, partly because of its position as a supply hub for the broader Colorado mining region. That capital investment may have funded more sophisticated construction than the settlement's age would normally predict. The presence of skilled European immigrant craftsmen in the labor force might explain the quality of the brickwork. These are real possibilities, but the discrepancy exists. B. It is observable to anyone who takes the underground tour, and it has not been adequately explained by the conventional historical account. The economic dimensions of the Denver Underground story are worth considering alongside the architectural and historical questions. The underground spaces are currently used primarily as a tourist attraction. Tours operate regularly, bringing paying visitors through the tunnels beneath Larimer Street. The spaces have been cleaned up, lit, and made navigable for the tourist experience, which necessarily involves some modification of what was originally there. This is not a conspiracy. It is how historic preservation works in a commercial context. You make the space accessible, you add lighting and safety infrastructure, and you present the history in the most coherent narrative available. The narrative available is the official one: frontier settlement, flood, street raising, buried city. It is a good story. It draws tourists. It is probably mostly true. What the tourist presentation does not address is the anomalies. The guides who take you through the underground are not misleading you when they tell you the official story. They are telling you what they know, which is the official story. The anomalies, the architectural sophistication, the documentary thinness, the scale of the engineering project supposedly conducted by a 3-year-old municipal government are not part of the tour script because they are not part of the official historical record that the tour is designed to present. The people who own and operate the underground tour are not suppressing anything. The anomalies are simply not part of their story, because their story is the official one, and the official story does not include the anomalies. The practical implication of the Tartaria reading of the Denver Underground is not primarily historical. It is epistemological. It is a question about how we know what we know about the past, and specifically, how we know what we know about the founding of American cities in the 19th century. The official history of Denver's founding is built on documentary evidence taken as primary authority: newspapers, land records, municipal records, personal diaries. The physical evidence is interpreted in light of those documents. What the Tartaria analysis does is invert this relationship. It takes the physical evidence as primary and asks whether the documentary record adequately explains it. When the answer is no, the Tartaria framework offers an alternative that better fits the physical evidence, even if it extends beyond what the documents record. The doors in the Denver Underground still open. The windows still have their frames. The cornices are still intact above storefronts on streets that no one walks anymore. Whatever explanation is correct for how they got there, they are there. And they will keep asking the question that the official story has not fully answered. And that is the Lower Denver, intact storefronts below streets that the official record says were raised after a flood, built with the craftsmanship of an established city that a 3-year-old frontier settlement should not have been able to produce. The doors are still there. The windows are still there. The cornices and the keystone arches and the decorated facades are all still there, exactly where they were when the street rose above them. The explanation is still incomplete. What was down there before the flood gave us a reason not to look too closely is a question that the underground keeps asking every time someone steps into it with a flashlight. Thanks for watching, and we will see you in the next one.